OPB Podcasts.
From the Gert Boyle Studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, March 5th. Each year, Oregon educators and school districts look to the state legislature to help patch funding gaps, maintain academic standards, and not create more budget problems with new mandates. As the sun sets on this year's legislative session in Salem, it appears there are going to be few wins for schools. Several anticipated bills to support schools fizzled out in committee, and proposals to fill funding gaps are thin. But there were some victories. Today, we're going to dig into those wins and losses against the backdrop of massive budget shortfalls across the education system. We'll get you up to speed. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Portland City Government reporter Alex Zielinski.
And I'm Tiffany Kam-Hai, higher education reporter for OPB.
I'm Elizabeth Miller. I cover K-12 education for OPB.
Liz, let's start with you.
Yeah.
So a few weeks ago, you and I went to a career day at a Portland school, and we spoke to this class of fourth graders. At the end, you asked the class for story tips, and this fourth grade kid was like, one of our teachers is getting her job cut next year. I was super impressed because it felt like that was not where my head was at when I was a fourth grader. I was more like, what's the Spice Girls next album? What's going on? Where's my Tamagotchi? To me, though, that's a measurement of how dire funding issues are. Kids are aware. Before we get into the legislature, can you remind us of the budget concerns of K-12 school districts in Oregon right now and kind of where that stood at the start of the session?
Yeah, students are plugged in, not just at that school. But school districts have been going through it financially for the last couple of years. We remember schools received a bunch of money after those COVID years, kind of getting out of COVID, money to catch kids up through tutoring, for example. But that money is long gone, and now schools are facing lower numbers of students, but rising costs. So like Salem Kaiser, one of the largest school districts in Oregon, they've got $23 million to cut this year. Portland Public Schools, Oregon's largest school district, they've got $50 million to cut this year. And that was before a kind of mid-year budget gap that they just discovered a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. But then if you look back the last 3 years, they've had to cut $80 million from their budget. So it's tough out there.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's grim. So let's pivot to the state's role here in filling those gaps. Some of our listeners may be very familiar with how the education system is funded in Oregon. I'll be honest, I'm not. Can you remind me how K-12 education is funded by the state and how lawmakers decide how much money schools should receive?
It is really complicated, so you are not alone, I'm sure. So Oregon schools get the biggest chunk of their funding from the state school fund, which is a big pot of money that gets doled out to school districts. And that money comes from tax revenue, including the marijuana tax, and it also comes from lottery revenue. And the way that money gets doled out to schools is through a weighted student funding formula. So schools get money based on how many students they have, but also they get an additional weight or a little bit more money if they have students who receive special education services or students who are English learners. But there's also some other funds. I don't know if you remember the Student Success Act that was passed back in 2019, and that is money that comes from a tax on businesses, the corporate activities tax. And then there's funding locally through property taxes, things like that. And that's it. Schools mainly get their money based on their enrollment, not anything like attendance or outcomes. But then there's this other kind of thing. So that's the reality, right? Mm-hmm. But then there's this quality education model, which I think we're going to talk a little bit more about, which is like, here's how much it would take to get a quality education in Oregon. It's a funding framework, basically. And so Oregon bases its education funding on that. And every 2 years, this group of commissioners comes together and says, this is how much. But it's outdated. And some folks in the education world would have liked to see that change this session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we should note that as of this taping, the legislature is still in session. Mm-hmm. And it's yet to pass its main budget bill, which includes funding for public schools. Right now, what do we know about that funding going forward?
Yeah, well, at a press availability last week, Governor Kotek has said that school funding will be maintained. It will not be cut.
We have districts right now who are making reductions. This would keep the state's commitment level through the rest of the biennium with the disconnect. So we're not taking any state dollars away from our schools, community colleges, or universities right now.
Thank you, Dirk Vanderhart, for that. He gave me the audio. But Governor Kotek's been getting some heat because she's basically said at this point that she doesn't see the state dipping into emergency reserves to give more money to schools. And so this is kind of another option that school leaders, teachers, parents have all been kind of eyeing this year. It's called the Education Stability Fund, and it's a state fund that's for emergencies.
This feels like an emergency.
You would think, yeah. And like I said, everyone has been asking. Like, it's something that everyone can agree on right now. Like, tap into this fund, and it would take 3/5 of the legislature and the governor declaring an emergency. But again, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. And so earlier this week, I feel like it's put Kotek in like a corner, basically, for people that have supported her for years, like teachers in Oregon. Earlier this week, the Capitol Chronicle reported that the Political Action Committee for the Oregon Education Association, which is the big teachers union, declined to endorse a candidate in the primary race for governor. I talked to OEA yesterday about that, and they were adamant. They were like, we want a candidate who shows their support for education, public education. And for them, that's not Kotek right now. Though they did say there may be another endorsement vote ahead of the general election. And we're pretty adamant that this is for the primary. Things could change. But I think that's a really tough sign for Governor Kotek, who's enjoyed strong support for teachers.
Yeah, it's significant. You mentioned the QEM earlier. One of the bills this session that died would have tweaked the way that works. Can you explain what that would have done and kind of what the opposition to that was?
Yeah, so this would have been a big overhaul of that funding framework, quality education model. And it's something that the commissioners who set that framework have been asking for. Changes to a system that's been done one way for 25 years. So this bill would have moved responsibility away from the Quality Education Commission, would have made, rather than every 2-year setting, here's what sufficient funding would be. It would be a little longer than that, several years longer. And then the goal of it would have been to connect what a quality education is in Oregon with the statewide targets that are coming out of Oregon's new education accountability system. So might have been a little more tied to the new landscape that we have in education. And the opposition was big, especially from big players in Oregon education, like the School Boards Association and the Coalition for School Administrators. Basically, they didn't like how quickly the bill came together, and they just wanted more time, more engagement, and wanted to be more involved. And I think it's interesting because it feels to me like one of those things that happens in Oregon with maybe not just education, maybe it's everything where it's like, okay, we need to think about this. We need a committee about this. And rather than taking action, we kind of pause the action. But I don't think, I think we're going to see more about this, especially in the 27 session. And I think having a longer session will maybe provide more opportunities for that.
More time to think and process and maybe form a committee. So what other K-12 funding proposals came from session? What else were you paying attention to, and how did they fare?
Yeah, another bill that's known as the disconnect bill, or I think it's known as the disconnect bill, would partially separate Oregon's tax code from federal policies included in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And that has passed both chambers. And it's something that school leaders, folks have been asking for as one of those, methods to help shore up education funding in Oregon.
Got it. Well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk to Tiffany about higher education. All right, we're back. Okay, Tiffany, the state's seeing similar budget shortfalls within higher education, similar to what we heard from Liz. Tell us about that. Why is that?
Yeah, well, as I was listening to Liz talk about the reasons why for K through 12, it's similar for higher education. There's 3 main reasons. Enrollment at colleges and universities are down. just like with K through 12. Costs to operate these institutions, just keeping them running, keeping the lights on, paying their people, those costs are up. And then support from the state legislature is basically flat and has been for a few years. So I can break those down a little bit more. So enrollment is so important for universities because they rely, especially in Oregon, the public universities and colleges rely on student tuition dollars to balance their budget. And that is tied to the support with the state legislature. The reason why they really rely on student tuition is because they don't get a lot of support from the state. And then costs are up. That's mostly attributed to personnel costs, so paying their administrators, paying faculty, paying staff, wages, benefits, healthcare, retirement. Those are way up. And basically they just can't. They're having a hard time balancing their budgets. And those are the three fiscal reasons that universities are just not doing well. There is a little bit, from the past year with the Trump administration cutting federal grants to universities. That is slightly a reason, but not really so much for Oregon's universities. Those are really targeted towards research grants.
And we've covered kind of some of the impacts to one university in particular, Southern Oregon University. Can you tell us a little bit about their funding crisis and how it got so dire?
Yeah, so I will say that a lot of the reporting has been done by Jane Vaughn at Jefferson Public Radio. Shout out, Jane. She's doing a great job. So they're based, that's in Ashland. Southern Oregon University is Ashland. It's a regional university. It's a smaller university compared to the OSUs, the UOs. I think in the 23-24 school year, they had about 5,000 students compared to OSU's 44,000. So it's small, but it's important for Ashland. It's an economic driver for that area, and it's an affordable university. A lot of students go there. They have been in an operating deficit for years. Liz was talking about, what was it, $50 million for PPS?
Yeah.
Okay, so SOU's is not as much. It's $14 million. They're looking at a $14 million deficit, but they've been like PPS, in a deficit for years. And this deficit, even though it's not as big as as PPS, it's existential for them. Like the university recently announced that they're projecting in 2 years they're not going to have enough cash to make their payroll. So it's not looking good for Southern Oregon University. But there is a provision in the end of session budget bill that would kind of buoy Southern for at least another year. $15 million.
Just to patch it.
$15 million, and that would be filtered through the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, which is the state agency, which is kind of like a pass-through agency that gives money to universities and colleges. There are some guardrails with this money. SOU has to provide monthly financial statements to the legislature, quarterly financial reports. The HEC has to provide some updated financial forecasts for the university. That appears to be moving right along. There's a House vote Friday, and there could be changes once that bill gets to the Senate, but it seems like there's support for this to keep Southern around.
Yeah.
So, for the next few years.
So there's a lifeboat for SOU, but like you mentioned, all public higher education universities are struggling from across the state. What else is being considered at the state legislature to address the bigger problem of higher ed funding statewide? Yeah,
so there is a bill that has passed, House Bill 4124, and it's acknowledging this crisis, this higher education crisis for Oregon's public universities and all the headwinds that higher education across the nation is facing. Everyone is facing the enrollment declines, the costs, and it's bad across the board. But anyways, House Bill 4124, directs the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, the HEC, to study Oregon's university system and basically provide some recommendations to the legislature by December 1st to make the system run more efficiently. And there are some controversial ideas that have been brought up in this bill, like possible institutional mergers. So maybe Southern Oregon University merges with Oregon State or something like that. I don't know. Don't quote me on that, but that's what it means.
Opening the door to that as
Right.
an option.
Yes. Yeah. Like, what would that look like, and how would we go about that? And there's also another controversial idea is a degree program audit. So possibly getting rid of programs where there's just not high enrollment or programs that cost a lot to run for universities. University administrators and faculty are really against this. They've spoken out against it, saying, the problem is not efficiencies. Our universities are already running as efficient as we can. The problem is underfunding, and they'll often cite this number or ranking from a nationwide higher ed nonprofit that ranks Oregon as 46th in the nation for funding its state universities, which is not a good look. And this was something that Southern Oregon University, who we've been talking about, SOU's president, Rick Bailey, he really hammered on this in a public hearing on this bill last month.
I recognize it may not be politically popular to sit here in this building and insist that our universities suffer from chronic underfunding, but we do. And I'm not going to back away from that charge as long as I'm a university president in this state.
Yeah. So supporters of this bill, they just say, look, we have to do something because there's not going to be, we just don't think there's not going to be any more support from the state because the state has all these other things that it's dealing with. It has to fund K through 12. It has to figure out how to fund SNAP, maybe. There's not going to.
The writing's on the wall.
Right.
They need to figure it out.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we need this bill to figure out how we're going to support our universities, how these universities like Southern Oregon are going to exist in the next 5 to 10 years. And like I said, that bill has passed both chambers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's moving ahead. So there were a few other education-related bills that came up in the legislative session that did pass. Can you guys talk a little bit more about some of those more specific ones?
Yeah, I'll start with there were 2 immigration-related education bills that were in the session, and the most prominent one was House Bill 4079, and this one requires public school districts and public colleges and universities to notify students, parents, and some community organizations if federal immigration enforcement is on school property. I will say it's not like this alert that would be sent out is not immediate. It would take 24 hours because a part of this bill says if immigration enforcement is on campus, it needs to be confirmed first.
Right, not just crying wolf.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Supporters of the bill who were school district superintendents, teachers, students, testified for this bill. They said it would just provide an extra layer of safety to students and parents, especially for school districts that are in communities that, have large Latinx or Hispanic populations. There was some pushback on it. Some lawmakers said this is just going to make extra work for school districts to set up this alert system. And others said it's redundant because school districts that don't feel safe have already made plans and they've already done something like this. That bill has passed, though. Yeah.
And this is for colleges, universities, and K-12?
Yeah,
Okay.
public school
schools.
districts, public colleges and universities.
Yeah. I think one thing that's interesting, kind of similar to the redundancy argument, is I noticed that a couple of bills that passed the session were kind of like guarding Oregon against federal changes. So there's one bill that passed that kind of just reiterates the support for students experiencing homelessness that exists in federal law, but it kind of like, okay, just if that goes away, Oregon students are going to be protected.
Codifying it here.
Yeah. And then one other bill that I'm really interested in that I think is indicative of Oregon's like slow method of solving problems is that we've got a really big chronic absenteeism problem. We don't have students attending schools consistently, and it's really bad. The latest chronic absenteeism rate, which is students missing 10% or more of school days, was 33.5%, a third of students. And last session, there was a bill championed by the late Rep. Hua Win that kind of called for, let's actually start taking this approach at a statewide level. And then there was a part of that bill, though, that came out, which was we're going to report attendance more regularly and more consistently. And I was really interested in that because I feel like in Oregon, we don't necessarily know how bad attendance is until the next school year. And so that, that bill last session would have increased attendance reporting to quarterly, which is something that school districts already report to the Oregon Department of Education. It would just make that data public. And that came out of that bill last year. But this session, a bill that included that passed. And so starting next fall, we're going to see some more regular attendance and chronic absenteeism tracking from Oregon. So I'm very excited.
You're excited for more data?
I love data.
Well, let's take a beat and just zoom out a little bit. You both have followed public education debates at the state level for a bit. I'm curious how you see this legislative session comparing to previous ones and kind of maybe what based on what was decided and passed and what failed, like what it tells you about the state of public education in Oregon and the future.
I can start on
Yeah,
that
jump
one.
in.
Yeah, that's a deep question, Alex. I do think I wrote a story earlier this session, earlier this year, because I just feel like we see the same thing over and over again. It's this schools need more money. They head into these sessions hoping for more money from the state. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. They also sometimes get unfunded mandates that they then have to find more money to support every year. And I just feel like that's how this session is similar, I think, to me. But what's interesting is like this year, you talked about the Southern Oregon University bill, Tiffany, or the funding. There was also a bill on the table to restore some of the funding for outdoor school that got cut last year. And outdoor school, it's a program that's like very unique to Oregon.
Beloved.
Yeah.
Beloved.
The only word for it.
Yes. And it's like I talked to the associate director for Friends of Outdoor School, which is like an advocacy group that supports outdoor school, yesterday. And he was like, it's in line with like the bottle bill and like the beaches. Like it's one of those things. But the funding got cut last year. And so this year there was a bill on the table to restore that funding, at least for the second half of the biennium. And 48 co-sponsors from the legislature.
Wow.
So much testimony, so many beautiful stories, and it failed. It died. I don't want to say it failed. It died. And so I just feel like that shows the really tough decisions that legislators are making, and just the really tough place that education is in right now. And something like outdoor school funding, like, doesn't pass.
But then fixing a hole for SOU does pass. And like, who knows what that tells us?
Yeah, well, I feel like, so higher ed has said for the past few years, oh, there's like a wildfire on the horizon and it's getting close to us. Maybe like, can the state of Oregon, can you help us? And Oregon doesn't really do that much. But now that one of the institutions is actively on fire and others are getting close to it, Oregon is doing something, but just like I think you'd mentioned, just like a Band-Aid. The $15 million is just a Band-Aid for Southern Oregon. There's only action being taken when it's like a huge emergency.
Just triage. Kind of. Yeah.
Yes, and the university efficiency study, that's something that could lead to it's a study. And so nothing's going to happen
study.
for
Study,
at least
committee.
another year,
Yep.
and it also doesn't cost the state that much to do a study. But I think this just says that the higher ed has always been the redheaded stepchild, forgotten, not really cared about that much. But there is some Oregon lawmakers are paying attention to it now, but only because it's on fire.
Yeah. I feel like I'm ready to see more studies become action.
Right. Yeah. Like, what do you do with that information?
Yeah.
And maybe we'll see that next legislative session. Maybe 5 years from now, we'll see. For this conversation, we'll leave it here for today. Tiffany and Liz, thank you so much for joining me.
Yes. Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
us.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Stephen Cray. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week to recap the Oregon legislative session. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.